Hello, class. Welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me today. Did you know that there was a revolution in England in the late 1680s because a Catholic king was on the throne? And his daughter and son-in-law, who was also his nephew, overthrew him and made him flee to France, forever changing the relationship between England and the colonies? That this revolution led to ideas of independence and limited representation in the colonies. That there were actually 3 wars between the British and the French from the late 1600s through the first half of the 1700s, not including the French and Indian War. And one of them actually began because a guy got his ear chopped off. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will learn that and more in episode 23, The Glorious Revolution. Hello and welcome to class. To catch everyone up, I want to briefly provide context for our lesson today. Last episode was our lesson on the triangular trade and mercantilism. We were able to get into detail about the goods shipped back and forth across the Atlantic and the approach that England took towards the colonies in order to try to maximize profit and control trade. Before we begin this lesson today, I would like to point out that a lot of my information and research has come from The American Colonies, The Settling of North America, a book by Alan Taylor. It's a great book. It gets into a lot of detail on the settling of the American colonies, and if you're interested in this topic, I would recommend that you check it out. We discussed that prior to the Navigation Acts in the 1650s, England did not really try to directly control the trade of the colonies, and at the same time, most colonists were too busy with their everyday lives to pay close attention to European powers and what was going on with their politics. So, to lay the groundwork for you for our lesson today, I just want to briefly sum up what's happening in England. So, in 1660, Charles II became king, and he paid little attention to colonial affairs. Therefore, the Navigation Acts, right, the ones that were passed a decade earlier in the 1650s, often weren't enforced as much as they should have been. Charles's brother, James II, the Duke of York, who we've mentioned before, he was always trying to convince Charles just how important the colonies were to the English Empire. With victories over the Dutch in the 16th century, the English basically controlled the entire Atlantic seaboard. So, in 1685, James II becomes king. England was dominating Atlantic trade, and its only real competition in the colonies were the French. James, though, wanted to reshape the colonies into a few large areas and wanted England to have more direct control over the colonies to make sure that the colonies were prosperous, once again, reinforcing the idea of mercantilism that we discussed last episode. When James ascended to the throne in England, it had a monumental impact on English and American history. See, James was a practicing Catholic, and as I mentioned, he viewed the colonies as a way to make money. But James was also a really unlikable guy. He used the military to control the colonies, and he was a bit of an authoritarian, something that began over time to naturally rub Parliament the wrong way. This authoritarian streak in James reared its ugly head when he decided to combine the 5 New England colonies to make the Dominion of New England, which stretched from present-day Canada down to the Delaware River. He figured that combining them into one larger dominion would make it much easier to have direct, or I guess technically indirect, control over them, but this way he could manage them much easier. So he chose a man named Edmund Andros as the governor of this dominion, and Andros did not have a great reputation in the colonies. and his behavior as governor only made it worse. He made all the Dutch men in the colonies take an oath of allegiance to the English crown. He only allowed one town meeting per year and severely limited the salaries of the Puritan clergy, while, of course, raking in an excessive salary for himself. He levied new taxes without asking any of the colonists, eliminated their assemblies, and issued new land grants, further taking power away from the ruling Puritan elite. The colonists claimed that they retained their Magna Carta rights when they came across the Atlantic, something that we talked about last episode, and unsurprisingly, Andros disagreed with this. At one point, an English official who worked for Andros said, quote, "You have no privileges left you not to be sold for a slave." Now, before we continue talking about activities in the colonies with relation to England, I want to touch on the fact that the closest ally of the English in the colonies, the Iroquois, were dominating their enemies, specifically the Mohawk who lived near Albany, New York. Andros did a pretty good job cultivating a relationship with the Iroquois, and the Iroquois controlled the Five Nations and much of the area to the west, which by default Andros, of course, claimed that the English also controlled. Much of this will be considered the Ohio River Valley. Remember that, because that area will become increasingly important as we continue through this podcast. The Iroquois and the English will have a tense relationship throughout much of the 18th century, and it will be solidified during the French and Indian War in the late 1750s, a war that was fought over that Ohio River Valley. And for those of you wondering exactly where that is, that's like your classic Midwest states today. So Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, etc. But let's shift back to Europe. We will begin once again with the obnoxious King James. Not only did his ideas of absolute power bother almost everyone in England, but his conversion to Catholicism horrified them. In 1688, things got even worse because James bore a son, and Parliament realized if this horrible Catholic king has a son, well, now there's an actual chance of a line of Catholic succession in our very Protestant country. In order to solve this seemingly unsolvable problem, Parliament reached out to William of Orange, who was the king of the Dutch Empire. He was also married to James's daughter, Mary, so he was James's son-in-law. He was also James's nephew, so it's a little weird. When Parliament reached out to James's son-in-law slash nephew slash king of the Dutch Empire, William, they did so hoping they would be able to force James to negotiate with them. This would, of course, give them some leverage, but William, being the ambitious ruler that he was, saw an opportunity and invaded England and forced James to flee to France. Like, no bloodshed. James just got up and went to France. This is going to lead to a significant power vacuum, which William and Mary will conveniently step right into. And as they do this, they of course are going to promise to cooperate with Parliament. One thing Taylor points out is that although it is called the Glorious Revolution, it was actually carried out technically by foreign forces, and that's not really ideal when you're having a revolution. Word reached the colonies about the coup in 1689, and the colonists decided they were going to take their own action, overthrowing officials in the Dominion of New England, and then tried to ingratiate themselves to their new King William. In April 1689, the rebel colonists arrested Andros and 25 of his officials, imprisoning all of them and taking control of the colony. Many of the New England colonies that had been forced into the Dominion of New England once again gained their independence, with William signing off on it. But everything wasn't as free as they had hoped. When Massachusetts proposed to have their own charter reinstated, the colonists were surprised to see that William insisted on a new one, and in 1691 this new charter was issued, stating that voters didn't have to belong to the Church of England, and religious toleration was extended to all Protestants, which basically effectively ended the 60 years of Puritan domination in the colonies. The effects of the Revolution could be seen in the English colonies, not just in the Dominion of New England, but specifically in the colony of New York and Maryland. Following the overthrow of Andros, Jacob Leisler took over the government in New York. But after not being able to gain much support, other than that of like middle and low-class Dutch, because he was a Dutchman, right? This was formerly New Netherland, and that's who he appealed to. He was eventually arrested by the newly appointed governor and executed. In Maryland, in 1689, there was a rebel militia that attacked the crown and said it would bring Maryland back under Protestant power, overthrowing the ruling Calvert family. Remember, Maryland was the only colony founded as a Catholic colony by the Calvert family. Maryland went from a proprietary colony ruled by the Calvert family to a royal colony, pretty much losing all Catholic identity in the process. With the overthrow of James, many colonists expected their lives to go back to normal with a considerable amount of independence. William, who was embroiled in a war with France when he entered England, was preparing to bring England into this war, and, he just left those in England who were in charge of the colonies still in charge of the colonies. So really not a lot changed when William and Mary took over. But while the colonies were unable to gain total political freedom, they were able to gain a bit of economic freedom. The sugar tax was reduced and the slave monopoly was ended. The colonists welcomed and recognized their role in this transatlantic empire and accepted the fact that they were working hard towards a larger goal of making England the most powerful nation in the world, and they took a lot of pride in that. On top of that, standing up against men like Edmund Andros made them feel as though they were sort of voluntarily part of this empire, and that the crown wasn't just forcing leaders upon them against their will, even though we know that if they needed to do that, they likely would have just done that. But anyway, we'll throw the colonists a bone here. While Parliament in England was passing laws to make sure that they had power to control William, the colonists in America incorrectly believed that their colonial assemblies were somewhat equal to that of Parliament. Because, see, during this glorious revolution, Parliament made sure that they were going to limit the power of the king. And that was sort of the deal. William could come in as long as he agreed to give Parliament more power. And like I mentioned, at the same time, the colonists had these local colonial assemblies, and they were acting as though these colonial assemblies were the sort of colonial representation of Parliament in the colonies. And Parliament and the colonists here were definitely flying at different altitudes, right? Their perspectives on representation were totally different, and this will bear out even more following the French and Indian War. The colonists believe that they really do have a stake in English government, and they do have representation, and that they do have a voice, while Parliament isn't taking them even remotely seriously. And eventually, we're going to see the colonists and Parliament just totally diverge and have a public recognition that they don't see things the same way, and this, of course, will lead to the revolution. But, anyway, let's get back to our lesson today. Although many of these colonists were excited and proud of their relationship with England through trade and mercantilism, numerous conflicts throughout the 18th century and the subsequent peace treaties often handed land over from the colonists back to the French. Once again, reminding the colonists that England wasn't really appreciating their efforts in the American colonies and definitely wasn't prioritizing their desires. There should have been a hint about their feelings of colonial representation, but they didn't quite pick up on that. For the rest of this episode, I'm going to detail the three different conflicts between the English and the French in the end of the 17th and first half of the 18th century that allowed England to rise and dominate the European landscape. Right after this. Hi class, I just want to let you know that if you would like to raise your hand and participate, please feel free to reach out. You can find me on Twitter with the handle @ATeachersHist, on Facebook @ATeachersHistoryPodcast. And if you're enjoying the podcast and if you're learning something, I would really appreciate it if you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It helps more people find our podcast research and will help more people learn about the history of the United States right along with us. Thanks so much. The first conflict I want to get into is one that I already mentioned, King William's War. This lasted from 1689 to 1697, and this is the war that William dragged England into because the Dutch Empire was already embroiled in the conflict with the French when he took over. It's also known as the 9 Years' War, and this war preserved English control of the American colonies and its hold on Ireland. The military expanded drastically and eventually included over 20,000 German mercenaries following this war. But this war, unsurprisingly, put England deep into debt. And this is going to be a running theme throughout the 18th century. England going to war, England falling really deep into debt, and Parliament pretty much having to raise taxes to pay off that debt. Right? So it's going to be a cyclical thing that is going to have serious consequences. Now, Parliament was in charge of raising taxes, like I mentioned, and because they were in charge of raising taxes, they had increasing leverage over the king. So in 1688, this idea of king and parliament was created because the king needed a parliament, because parliament raised the revenue. And without their revenue, he couldn't run the country or wage war. So this is something to keep in mind as we move forward. The reign of James pretty much ended the absolute and at times, tyrannical rule of English monarchs. In the colonies during King William's War, there were some sporadic skirmishes and small battles in the New England region with the French. England at this time did not fret too much about their colonies, though, because, well, they had such a large population advantage over the French, they couldn't really envision how they could possibly be beaten. Unsurprisingly, the colonies had a hard time uniting to fight against the French anywhere, and eventually became resentful towards England for involving them in a war they never really wanted to be in the first place. While the English colonists suffered a bit, the Iroquois suffered greatly during this conflict, and they were disappointed with the fact that the English were either unable or, more importantly, unwilling to support them against the French and the French native allies. This lack of support led to the Grand Settlement of 1701, where the Iroquois decided they were going to stay neutral between the French and the English, and because of their geographic location, they basically acted as a buffer between the two. This brings us to the Second War between the French and the English, lasting from 1702 to 1713, known as the War of Spanish Succession. This war was to prevent the Spanish and French from uniting under the Bourbons. In 1702, Louis XIV had rebuilt the military after King William's War, and he saw an empty throne in Spain, and it seemed that it was a throne that would perfectly fit his grandson Philip. England, of course, wanting to make sure that Spain and France did not join together as a united power against them, went to war with France to preempt this from happening. The English were able to score a couple surprising victories in Europe, and in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, the Spanish and the French agreed that they would stay separate, with the French giving up Acadia, Newfoundland, and the Hudson Bay. So some pretty important territory went over from the French to the English here. And more importantly, the English also gained a 30-year contract to provide slaves to the Spanish colonies, and they were able to pry Gibraltar away from Spain too. Overall, the War of Spanish Succession, or Queen Anne's War, named after the reigning queen at the time, Mary's younger sister, was a wild success for the English. In the colonies, the Carolinians attacked St. Augustine, which failed spectacularly, and they had to retreat back to Carolina, and once again, the French and the natives in the north were terrorizing the colonial frontier. But the English and their colonial brothers were able to score a couple small victories at sea, so it was pretty much a wash in the colonies. And just a side note, pretty cool stuff going on in Scotland at this time. So since 1603, Scotland and England had pretty much operated independently, and after the War of Spanish Succession, the Scots wanted their independence but weren't really able to obtain it. See, in the 1690s, after William took over in England, the Scots tried to create their own empire and colonize Panama. Yes, that's right, Panama. After this bold exploration failed very quickly, unsurprisingly, the Scots were then left in a pretty vulnerable position. In 1705, the English threatened to close off the border unless they united with England. England promised all of those Scottish investors who lost their money on the ridiculous Panama expedition large payments, and the Scots eventually agreed, creating Great Britain. The Scots gained a few seats in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, which is the two houses in the English Parliament, sort of like our House of Representatives and Senate, if you're unfamiliar with them. And the coinage, the flag, and the military were all the same between England and Scotland. But the two retained distinct, separate legal, educational, and church powers. It's at this point that a large number of the Scottish begin to emigrate from Scotland to the colonies. So the final conflict that we will discuss today lasted from 1740 to 1748 and is known as the War of Austrian Succession, or King George's War. This war began because the British thought that they were losing control of the sugar trade in the Caribbean islands that were controlled by the Spanish. So, just like any powerful nation would do that's threatened, they attacked. A smuggler named Robert Jenkins was captured by the Spanish and actually had his ear cut off. Jenkins, stirring up the crowd by holding his ear up and cursing the Spanish, began the war known as Jenkins' Ear. I can't even make this stuff up. These smugglers and English sailors went to war with Spain because Jenkins got his ear cut off. And then this will actually merge into the larger King George's War that saw more fighting, again in the colonies, specifically in the New England region, but not much changing hands, except for one very significant colonial action. In 1745, almost 4,000 colonists attacked Louisburg, which guarded the entrance to the St. Lawrence, and they were able to take control of it. And this is a huge victory for the colonists. But after the war, the colonists found out that England ceded this land back to the French, making all of their efforts totally worthless. At this point, the colonists were becoming frustrated by what seemed like England's unwillingness to take them seriously and have any type of respect for their situation in the colonies. And as we know, it's only going to continue to get worse. Before we wrap up this episode, I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about pirates because, pirates are awesome. Initially, piracy was really useful for the English in the early 1600s because they would allow pirates like Sir Francis Drake to attack the Spanish and take all their gold and silver from them. And it worked out great for the English when the pirates were working for them. Colonial governments would even give them cover, naming them privateers, and this gave them official support, and all seemed well. But when England became the dominant shipping power, they soon realized that the pirates are now pirating their own people. I mean, what the hell, man? It's almost like these pirates aren't loyal to the King of England. Who'd have thought? The pirates continued to be a thorn in everyone's side throughout the 1600s and into the 1700s. They developed their own counterculture to prove how different they were from the normal naval society. They lived with reckless abandon and enjoyed lives of excess, pleasure, sex, and alcohol. The pirates would usually take over a ship, and then they'd turn to the crew, and they would ask the crew if the captain had been treating them well, because many of these pirates were former sailors. They were jaded, they were resentful, and they really wanted to punish these captains as a way of getting vengeance for the, captains who treated them so poorly. And usually, if the crew would say the captain was in fact treating them poorly, they would then execute the captain. But they weren't always made to walk the plank like you've seen in the films. And they likely did not speak with ridiculous accents and wear eyeliner like in Pirates of the Caribbean. Pirate ships believe it or not, operated with a democratic approach, actually. For the most part, they all shared in the riches of their adventures, and no pirate could be punished without the consent of the majority. By the turn of the 18th century, the English began to pass new legislation, though, preventing merchants in the colony from assisting the pirates and really starting to crack down on piracy because, now the piracy is having a negative effect on them. Over time, after periods of apathy, the English were eventually able to root out much of the piracy in the Caribbean and the Atlantic. Hundreds of pirates were actually taken back to England and executed, and their lack of support in the colonies made their endeavors far more difficult. As you pack up your things, I would like you to consider the state of the English Empire on the precipice of the French and Indian War in 1754. Throughout their conflicts with the Dutch and the French in the late 1600s and the early 1700s, England clearly became the most dominant power in the world. London was the financial capital of the world, and their contract with the African slaves gave them a leg up on such a valuable trade commodity. One issue the English had, which we mentioned, was the massive debt they found themselves in after all of this warfare, which just made the colonies that much more important to their future, since they knew the colonies were a source of such potential wealth. Through trade, the colonists began to feel even more tied to the English, but simultaneously seeds of independent thought and political liberty were planted. Next episode, which is actually going to be released this Thursday, since I had to take a week off last week, I'm giving you 2 episodes this week. Next episode, Bill and I are doing an extra credit episode covering a specific example of these ideas of liberty, the John Peter Zenger trial and the birth of the freedom of the press. From there, we will then discuss the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment, 2 movements that further created a sense of independence in the colonies. And then after that, then we ramp up towards conflict and prepare ourselves for the French and Indian War, the Revolutionary period, and eventually the Revolutionary War. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. Like I mentioned, next episode, Bill and I will be talking in depth about the John Peter Zenger trial, which is actually a really fascinating and interesting trial that will have a monumental impact on American history, which is crazy because most people have never even heard of it. See you then.